The November issue of Wood Magazine, on page 34, has a little project article. They give you the patterns and a step-by-step pictorial about how to go about cutting out one of these boxes. I thought it might be interesting to show you how I cut mine out so you can see the actual step-by-step process. I decided to make a couple of these using Purple Heart and walnut. Part of their process is to take a thick piece, and after you cut out the general shape, to slab off a 1/4 inch thickness, which will end up being the bottom of the box. My material wasn't quite as thick as what they called out for, so I also got some thin stock, which will serve as the bottom. This Purple Heart is an interesting material. When you buy it, it's real pretty like this, and when you sand it, it turns brown, and you lose that color. It was browner than this yesterday, but you leave that out in the light and it will return to that color. And the longer it sits out, the more purple it becomes. And hard, this is the definition of hard. Trying to cut this out on a scroll saw is asking a lot for a number 5 blade. I sprayed glue on the pattern, attached it to this thick piece, rough cut that, and the bottom part. On here I put double-sided tape, and that will be glued onto that bottom piece. Got the outside cut out. So now I'm going to go to the spindle sander and to a belt sander. This double-sided tape can really hang on tight sometimes. Warm it up with a heat gun. And gently lift up on that. Some pretty thin sections here. You don't want to break one after all this work. Peel off the rest of this tape. You can use one piece to pull off the next. And you'll have a little residue on there. Clean it up with some mineral spirits. Now we'll go in with the scroll saw and we make these puzzle cuts on the top and bottom fin. Sometimes those are a little difficult to get out. The sawdust will pack in alongside of that saw blade, and you think that you're cutting straight, but actually it's bowed a little bit. So now I have to go in with the Dremel tool, clean up the bottom of that notch, and clean this up to where it'll go in and out as easily as this one's trying to. Now this one, it'll drop out towards the bottom. It needs to come out to the top. Puzzle key flared out on the bottom. So I'll have to sand that down, make the upper part of this notch a little wider so it'll go in the top just as easily as it does the bottom. Because this is glued to that bottom piece and all these have to go in from the top. So that will require a bit of work. I needed to remove a little high spot right in through here. I couldn't get to it with any of the Dremel tools. So I go in here with this saw blade and just move it back and forth. And that saw blade will hit here, but it will not distort the part that we can see. And just removed a little bit of material. Now that falls down in there like it's supposed to. Won't quite come out the bottom, but it doesn't need to come out the bottom. This needs to go in from the top. And now the next problem child. The purpose of the keyed fins is to hold the lid in place. You remove the two fins and then the lid will slide off on another keyed section, and that's the purpose of the second pattern. We'll glue that on there. We'll cut this out on the bandsaw. This needs to be square and it's fairly solid, but I clamped this to another block just to provide a little more stability until I get to the very end of this cut. I've drawn the outline that we'll cut out on the scroll saw, which is the inside of the box. And now I need to drill a starting hole for the blade on the scroll saw. And now we need to drill the eye. Need to make one final cut for the gills. Not everything turns out the way you want it to. When you remove the lid, there's supposed to be an internal lid, and that's made out of this section that was cut out of here. I decided to use a finer scroll saw blade, and with the deflection of that blade on this thick cut, I couldn't get it out of there. I had to take it out in pieces. So this one will not have an internal lid. We'll just slide that in there and install the two fins that locks the lid in place. We'll call that good. Because of the thickness of this cut that we did on the bandsaw, this lid sits a little bit lower than what it did before we made that cut. And now these two fins are a little bit higher. So then we got to take these off, go to the disc sander, reduce the thickness until that fits in there just nice. Here's my school of fish. You take one of these apart that turned out correctly, you remove the locking tabs, slide the lid off, and you can see there's an inner lid in a very small area in the box. It serves no particular purpose other than being another part to the puzzle. And while this one does not have the inner lid, it's still a perfectly usable little box once it gets glued onto the bottom part. The purple, I've had this sitting in pieces on the coffee table, and the longer it sits, the more it returns to its original color. You can see this is still a bit light. Light turns the color back to purple, and so does heat. You can see where the scroll saw blade got that quite hot and caused it to turn a very dark color. You can do the same thing in the oven. I've experimented with that, but it was a bit blotchy, so I wouldn't recommend that. I'm going to leave these in natural color. I can put linseed oil on it, but it gets very dark. It turns more to a dark red. I like this color better. The walnut will get linseed oil on it. Kind of a fun project. Hope you enjoyed seeing it.